The morning of January 8th, 1967 began like any other over the Red River Delta. A pale winter haze clung to the limestone-karst ridges north of Hanoi, softening the edges of the world below. At Phuc Yen Airfield, 14 miles northwest of the capital, two MiG, 21 interceptors, sat fueled and armed on the runway apron. Their pilots, young men in their mid-20s, graduates of Soviet flight academies in Krasnodar and Akhtubinsk, drank tea in the ready room and waited for the order that would send them climbing into the gray morning sky. They had every reason to feel confident. In the months since the first American jets had crossed into North Vietnamese airspace, the MiG pilots of the Vietnam People's Air Force had proven something that Washington had not expected and Hanoi had desperately needed them to prove. They were not helpless. They were not outmatched. They were, in fact, winning on paper in the kill ratios that mattered to politicians and planners on both sides of the Pacific. The Americans, with their supersonic F-105 Thunder Chiefs and their radar-guided Sparrow missiles, were losing more aircraft to MiGs than anyone in the Pentagon had anticipated when the air war began. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What was happening over in North Vietnam in the years between 1965 and 1967 was not simply a tactical contest between competing aircraft. It was a collision between two entirely different theories of air warfare, two different philosophies of what a fighter pilot was supposed to be and do and believe. And embedded within that collision was a trap, one that neither side fully understood was being built until the moment it closed. The story of Operation BOLO and of the broader deception campaign that preceded it begins not with the pilots who flew it, but with the men who could not, the men who watched the kill ratios climb and understood, with the cold precision of engineers reading tolerances on a failed component, that something in the American system had broken, and that unless they found out exactly what had broken and why, the war in the air over North Vietnam was going to continue extracting a price that no amount of political resolve could sustain. By the spring of 1966, the United States Air Force had deployed the most sophisticated tactical aircraft in the world to bases in Thailand and South Vietnam. The Republic F-105 Thunder Chief, known universally among its crews as a Thud, was a large, fast, single-engine strike aircraft designed primarily to deliver nuclear weapons at low altitude in a European war. It had been pressed into the role of conventional strike bomber in Southeast Asia, flying daily missions against the bridges, rail lines, fuel depots, and surface-to-air missile sites that American planners hoped would gradually strangle North Vietnam's capacity to wage war in the South. The F-105 was formidable in the role it had been designed for. In the role it was actually flying, it carried heavy bomb loads that reduced its maneuverability, flew predictable routes that Vietnamese radar operators memorized within weeks, and operated under rules of engagement that required pilots to approach targets from specific directions at specific altitudes, largely negating the advantage of surprise. It was, in the phrase that circulated among the men who flew it, a truck driver's airplane being asked to fight a boxer's fight. Against this rigid, heavily constrained operation, the Vietnam People's Air Force employed a doctrine of almost pure opportunism. North Vietnamese ground controllers, trained by Soviet advisors and equipped with a growing network of early warning radars, tracked every inbound American strike package from the moment it entered North Vietnamese airspace. They waited. They studied the approach vectors, identified the moment of maximum American vulnerability, usually the few minutes when the Thunder Chiefs were committed to their bomb run and could not maneuver freely, and then they launched their MiGs in slashing, high-speed attacks from unexpected angles. The MiG-17, the older of the two interceptors in North Vietnamese service, was a subsonic aircraft outperformed in raw speed by nearly every American jet in theater. It had no radar, no guided missiles, only 3 cannons. On paper, it should have been irrelevant. In practice, it was terrifying. The MiG-17 could turn inside an F-105 with contemptuous ease, and in the close range, turning engagements that Vietnamese tactics were designed to produce, the American advantage in speed and electronics was neutralized almost completely. The MiG-21, newer and faster, played a complementary role. It would approach at high altitude and high speed, fire its heat-seeking ADHAL missiles at the strike aircraft from behind, and disengage before American fighter escorts could react. Hit and run, strike and vanish. Never linger long enough to be caught in a sustained engagement where American numbers and aircraft performance could tell. This was a system that Colonel Robin Olds arrived to confront in September of 1966 when he took command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand. Olds was 44 years old. He had shot down 12 German aircraft in World War II flying P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs over Europe. He had won the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 4 clusters, the Air Medal with 11 clusters. He was, by any measure, one of the most experienced combat aviators alive. He was also, from his first weeks in Thailand, deeply and vocally unhappy with what he saw. The F-4 Phantom II, the aircraft his wing flew, was in 1966 arguably the finest air superiority fighter in American service. It was fast, it was powerful, it had a crew of 2, a pilot and a weapons systems officer, and it carried both radar-guided Sparrow missiles and heat-seeking Sidewinders. On paper, it should have been destroying MiGs in significant numbers. It was not. The reasons were multiple and interlocking and, as Olds quickly concluded, almost entirely self-inflicted. American pilots had been trained, in the years since Korea, for a war against Soviet bombers and Soviet fighters in a nuclear environment where close-range maneuvering combat was considered obsolete. The assumption had been that missiles would dominate future air warfare, that the age of the dogfight was over, that a modern fighter needed only to find its target on radar, fire its missile from beyond visual range, and return to base. This assumption had driven the design of the F-4 itself. Early production models carried no internal gun. The Air Force had decided that missiles had made guns unnecessary. The Sparrow radar-guided missile, the primary weapon American pilots were expected to use in beyond visual range combat, had a reliability rate in actual combat conditions that hovered, in the early years of the Vietnam Air War, somewhere between 15 and 20%. Missiles fired at MiGs over North Vietnam failed to guide, failed to detonate, lost tracking lock in the ground clutter of the hills below, or simply did not function as advertised. The training that American pilots had received was, in the specific environment of the Vietnam Air War, actively counterproductive. Pilots who had spent their careers rehearsing beyond visual range missile attacks found themselves in close-turning engagements they had not trained for against lighter, more maneuverable aircraft flown by pilots who had trained for exactly this kind of fight. The kill ratio that had been confidently projected before the air war began, the comfortable American advantage that planners had assumed would accumulate steadily as the campaign continued, had not materialized. By mid-1966, the air-to-air exchange rate between American and North Vietnamese aircraft was approaching a ratio that, had it been achieved against a major power with unlimited aircraft reserves, would have been catastrophic. America was not losing the air war, but it was not winning in the way that anyone had expected or that the political and military cost of the campaign could sustain indefinitely. Robin Olds understood this with the clarity of a man who had actually shot down enemy aircraft in combat and knew the difference between what training manuals described and what happened when 2 fighters were turning hard at low altitude with someone trying to kill them. He also understood something more specific, something that the kill ratio statistics, abstracted into reports and briefings and staff analyses, did not quite capture. The North Vietnamese were not winning because they were better pilots. They were winning because they were smarter about when and how they chose to fight. They controlled the engagement. They chose the moment, the geometry, the altitude, the speed. They hit when American pilots were committed and predictable and could not respond. They disengaged before the terms of the fight could shift in American favor. The solution, as Olds conceived it, was not to fly better or complain about rules of engagement or to wait for better missiles. The solution was to take control of the engagement back from the Vietnamese, to lure the MiGs into a fight they thought they were choosing, at a moment they thought was optimal, in a geometry they thought they understood, and then, when they had fully committed, to reveal that every assumption they had made was wrong. The idea that Olds developed in collaboration with his operations officer Major Ralph Wetteron and the wing's weapons and tactics specialists was elegant in its fundamental conception and extraordinarily complex in its execution. Its name was Operation BOLO. The premise rested on a single observed fact about North Vietnamese air defense behavior. MiG interceptors were launched against American strike packages, not against American fighter sweeps. The Vietnamese ground controllers, reading their radar scopes and hardened command centers across the Red River Delta, had learned to distinguish between the two. An F-105 strike package had a distinctive radar signature, a distinctive flight profile, a distinctive electronic emissions pattern from the jamming pods of Thunder Chiefs carried to suppress surface-to-air missile radars. An F for fighter sweep looked different, sounded different electronically, and was left largely alone, because Vietnamese controllers knew that a fighter sweep without bombers had nothing worth fighting over. The Thunder Chiefs were the targets. The MiGs waited for the Thunder Chiefs. What if, Olds proposed, the Thunder Chiefs did not come? What if F-4 Phantoms flew the exact same routes, at the exact same altitudes, at the exact same speeds, with the exact same electronic emission signature that the Thunder Chiefs always used? What if every element of the radar picture seen by Vietnamese ground controllers was identical to what they saw every day when the strike packages came north? The MiGs would launch. They would position for their standard intercept. They would come in expecting to find heavily loaded F-105s committed to a bomb run, unable to maneuver, vulnerable, easy. They would instead find F-4 Phantoms, clean, unburdened by bombs, flown by pilots who had come not to strike a target, but to kill interceptors. The bait was a familiar. The trap was a substitution. The operational problem, as Olds and his planners worked through it over weeks of detailed preparation in late 1966, was not conceptual but technical and logistical, and it was immense. The F-105 Thunder Chief and the F-4 Phantom were not interchangeable aircraft. They flew at different airspeeds. They consumed fuel at different rates. They had different electronic equipment with different emission characteristics. For the deception to work, the F-4s would have to fly precisely the speed and altitude profile of the Thunder Chief strike, carry jamming pods normally fitted only to Thunder Chiefs, and use call signs, radio procedures, and formation geometries identical to those of Thunder Chiefs used every day. The jamming pods were perhaps the most critical element. The EA-6 jamming pods carried by F-105 Wild Weasel aircraft and Strike Thunder Chiefs produced a very specific electronic signature, one that Vietnamese radar operators had been listening to for months and had incorporated into their identification procedures. An inbound formation without those pods, or with pods producing a different signature, would be identified immediately as a fighter sweep and ignored. With the correct pods, properly operated, the formation would look, to every electronic sensor in the Vietnamese air defense network, exactly like the strike package it was impersonating. Olds requested the pods. The request worked its way up the chain of command, and back down again with what he later described as agonizing slowness. The Air Force logistics system was not designed for this kind of cross-equipment improvisation. Eventually, after negotiations that consumed weeks, a sufficient number of the appropriate jamming pods were made available to the 8th Wing. The next problem was coordination. A single fighter wing could not execute operation beyond the lookout alone. The plan called for multiple flights of F-4s, each assigned to a different holding area above the cloud deck that perpetually blanketed the Red River Delta in January, positioned to intercept any MiGs that launched from any of the 3 primary North Vietnamese fighter bases, Phuc Yen, Kep, and Gia Lam. The U Binh Wing would cover the western approaches. F-4s from the 366 Tactical Fighter Wing at Da Nang, across the border in South Vietnam, would cover the eastern and southern routes. This multi-wing coordination required a level of inter-unit planning that was unusual in an Air Force accustomed to operating wings as relatively self-contained tactical units. Communication between the wings had to be tight enough that no gaps appeared in the coverage, but secure enough that Vietnamese signals intelligence could not piece together what was being planned from intercepted radio traffic. The debrief record from the planning phase of Operation BOLO, declassified in the decades after the war, reveal a process that was equal parts tactical genius and bureaucratic obstacle course. Olds was not a man given to patience with obstacles. He was known in the wing, and in the Air Force generally, as a commander who considered administrative resistance to a sound tactical idea to be a form of professional negligence. He worked around obstacles where he could, threw them where he had to, and accepted no substitutes for what his plan required. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The route planning was meticulous. Every flight would follow the exact ground track that the Thunder Chief strike packages use on their most common missions into the Red River Delta. The altitudes, the airspeeds, the timing of jamming pod activation, the formation spacing, all of it was mapped against what Vietnamese controllers had come to expect. The plan was not a departure from the familiar. It was a familiar, perfectly reproduced, inhabited by something the Vietnamese controllers had no reason to suspect was there. There was a final element of the deception that is rarely emphasized in the accounts of Operation BOLO that appeared in the years immediately after the war. It concerned not the aircraft or the electronics or the route planning, but the radio calls. Vietnamese signals intelligence was listening to American tactical radio frequencies. They had been listening for months. They had cataloged the voices, the call signs, the phraseology that Thunder Chief pilots use on their strike missions. A formation of F4s using F4 call signs and F4 radio procedures will be identified as F4s, regardless of what their jamming pods were emitting. The radio traffic had to match the impersonation completely. Olds solved this by assigning his pilots the specific call signs that Thunder Chief flights used and briefing them on the radio procedures that Thunder Chief drivers employed in the strike environment. F4 pilots, trained in a different tactical culture with different radio habits, would fly into North Vietnamese airspace talking like Thunder Chief pilots. The Vietnamese controllers, listening to their receivers in their hardened bunkers, would hear exactly what they heard every day when the strike packages came north. What they would not hear was the difference between the sound of a pilot delivering bombs and the sound of a pilot hunting for something to kill. The date selected for Operation BOLO was January 2nd, 1967. It was then postponed once for weather, rescheduled, postponed again. The Red River Delta in January was notorious for its persistent cloud cover, layered, dense, and operationally limiting in ways that affected both sides equally, but penalized the American plan in specific ways. The Vietnamese MiG bases had radar approach systems that allowed their pilots to take off and land in almost any weather. The American plan required visual acquisition of the MiGs once they rose above the cloud deck, because the missile technology of the period was not reliable enough for purely radar-guided kills in a high-clutter environment. If the cloud deck sat too high, the F-4s would be shooting into overcast at targets they could not see. If it sat too low, the MiGs might choose not to climb above it, negating the entire engagement. Olds waited. His intelligence officer tracked the weather forecast daily. The planners adjusted and readjusted timings. The pilots flew practice runs in Thailand, rehearsing the exact flight profiles the operation required, maintaining the formation spacings and the altitudes and the radio procedures until the impersonation became habitual, reflexive, something they could execute under pressure without having to consciously remember what they were supposed to be doing. On the morning of January 2nd, 1967, the weather was acceptable, not perfect, but acceptable. The cloud deck over the Red River Delta sat at approximately 6,000 feet, with broken coverage above that level. MiGs climbing out of Phuc Yin would break into the clear somewhere around 8,000 feet. The F-4s, holding above the cloud layer at 15,000 feet and above, would have time to acquire and engage. Olds walked to his aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness of a Yuban flight line. His crew chief met him at the ladder. Olds had flown 2 wars. He had accumulated more than 3,000 flight hours. He had, by his own account, been afraid before combat missions in a way that he learned over time to recognize as useful, a sharpening of attention, a narrowing of focus to what mattered. He climbed into the cockpit of his F-4C, ran through the pre-flight checks, and waited for the engine start sequence. His call sign for the mission was Olds 1. The flight of 4 he led would be the first to arrive over the target area. 7 other flights of F-4s from Yuban and additional flights from Da Nang would follow in a precise sequence designed to ensure that a fresh, fully armed American flight was always in position regardless of how long the Vietnamese took to launch their interceptors. The planning had accounted for the possibility that the Vietnamese might not come up at all. There was no guarantee that the deception would work, no certainty that the MiG controllers would fall for an impersonation they had never encountered before. The Vietnamese air defense system had been fooled before and had adapted. It had adapted, specifically, to the previous American attempt to lure MiGs into a trap, an effort in April of 1966 that had been transparent enough that Vietnamese controllers simply kept their MiGs on the ground until the American fighters left. The Vietnamese were not passive targets. They were observant, adaptive, and had been watching American air operations over the Red River Delta long enough to have developed a sophisticated picture of American patterns and habits. Olds knew this. His plan was designed to exploit the very sophistication of the Vietnamese observation apparatus. The more carefully the Vietnamese controllers watched for American patterns, the more completely they would be deceived by a pattern that matched their expectations perfectly. The strike package from U Binh crossed into North Vietnamese airspace at altitude, jamming pods active, call signs appropriate, formation spacing precise. In the hardened command centers of the Vietnamese Air Defense Network, radar operators watched the inbound formation and saw what they had been trained to see: a large strike package, F-105s, coming in on the western route, the same route the Thunder Chiefs used when they were targeting the Thanh Nguyen Steel Complex or the rail lines north of Hanoi. The controllers checked their aircraft readiness. The MiGs at Phuoc Yen were armed and fueled. The pilots were in their cockpits. The formation was, by every indicator available to Vietnamese intelligence, exactly what it appeared to be. Old's one flight crossed the initial point and began the descent profile that a Thunder Chief strike would use when setting up for a bomb run. In the Vietnamese GCI Center, a controller reached for his radio. The MiGs rolled. 7 MiG-21s climbed out of Phuoc Yen, accelerating hard, vectored northwest by ground controllers toward what they were absolutely certain was a strike formation of F-105 Thunder Chiefs, heavily loaded, committed to their run, unable to maneuver, predictable, vulnerable, the same target they've been hunting and hitting for the past 18 months. They were wrong about every single assumption. Old saw the MiGs climbing through the cloud deck at 6,000 feet. He keyed his radio. Heads up, Old's flight, bandits, 9 o'clock, climbing. He rolled his F-4 into a hard turn, dropping the nose, accelerating toward the climbing MiGs with the sudden, violent purpose of an aircraft that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The North Vietnamese pilots had expected F-105s. They had built their attack geometry around the size, the speed, the maneuverability limitations of the aircraft they believed they were engaging. They had approximately 3 seconds from the moment the first F-4 completed its turn to understand that their ground controllers had been deceived, that the formation they had been vectored toward was not what had appeared, that the aircraft now rolling down at them were not bombers. 3 seconds was not enough time. The engagement over the Red River Delta on January 2nd, 1967 lasted, in its primary phase, less than 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, 7 North Vietnamese MiG-21s were shot down. Not one American aircraft was lost to air-to-air combat. It was the single most one-sided American air-to-air engagement of the entire Vietnam War. Robin Olds personally shot down 2 MiGs. His flight of 4 destroyed 4 of the 7 kills in the opening minutes of the engagement. The subsequent American flights, arriving in their precisely planned sequence, caught the MiGs that had survived the initial attack as they attempted to disengage and reached the safety of their airfields. The Vietnamese ground controllers, listening to the radio calls from their pilots in the turning, diving engagement above the clouds, tried to vector reinforcements from Kep and Gia Lam. The additional MiGs never reached a firing position. The coverage plan that Olds had built, the careful sequencing of fresh flights at every potential escape route, worked as designed. The Vietnamese interceptors that launched from the eastern fields ran into waiting American fighters before they could effect the engagement. The losses absorbed by the Vietnam People's Air Force on January 2nd, 1967 were, by the metrics of the small air arm, they were trying to preserve and husband through a war against a vastly larger opponent, very nearly catastrophic. The MiG-21 force, which numbered at that time perhaps 30 operational aircraft, lost 7 of them in a single morning. 7 pilots were dead or captured. The Phuoc Yen base, from which most of the day's losses had launched, stood down from combat operations for weeks afterward. More significantly, the doctrine that had carried North Vietnamese interceptors through 18 months of successful combat against American strike packages had been turned against itself. The Vietnamese had been defeated not by superior aircraft or superior missiles, but by the destruction of the assumption that made their entire system work. They had assumed they knew what an inbound formation was before it arrived. That assumption had been correct reliably, consistently, for a year and a half. It had been correct because the Americans, constrained by their own operational habits and their own tactical conservatism, had never thought to challenge it. Olds had challenged it. He had taken the Vietnamese confidence in their own pattern recognition and used it as the mechanism of their destruction. The trap had been built from the materials the Vietnamese themselves had provided, their own observations, their own procedures, their own certainty that the familiar would remain familiar. The aftermath of Operation BOLO unfolded on 3 levels simultaneously. The tactical level was immediate and measurable. The strategic level took months to become apparent. And the institutional level, the deepest and in some ways the most consequential, took years, and in certain respects is still not fully resolved. At the tactical level, the Vietnamese response to January 2nd was a combination of predictable and the surprising. The predictable response was a stand down at Phu Quyen, the rebuilding of the MiG-21 inventory through accelerated Soviet deliveries, and the retraining of pilots in the specific counter-tactics that American F-4s would employ if they were ever again allowed to enter North Vietnamese airspace as something other than what they appeared. Vietnamese ground controllers were ordered to treat any inbound formation that did not conform precisely to expected parameters as potentially hostile regardless of its apparent electronic identity. The surprising response was the acceleration of North Vietnamese investment in the third element of their air defense system, the one that neither Operation BOLO nor any subsequent American deception could fully account for, the surface-to-air missile network. The SA-2 guideline, the Soviet-supplied radar-guided missile that had been responsible for a significant fraction of American aircraft losses since the war began, was present in North Vietnam in large numbers and growing. The Vietnamese had learned from each American electronic countermeasure, each new jamming technique, each new tactic designed to suppress or avoid the SA-2 batteries, and had adapted their missile employment with a speed and ingenuity that impressed the American electronic warfare specialists who were paid to understand it. If the MiG force was going to be reduced by American deceptions, the SA-2 force would have to absorb more of the burden. Between January and October of 1967, the period immediately following Operation BOLO, American aircraft losses to surface-to-air missiles increased significantly, while losses to MiGs declined. The Vietnamese were not accepting the tactical lesson of January 2nd as a permanent constraint on their options. They were redistributing the load across the elements of their defense system that the American deception had not touched. The strategic level was more ambiguous and more consequential. Operation BOLO had demonstrated that it was possible to lure North Vietnamese interceptors into an engagement on American terms. But the demonstration had required a level of preparation, coordination, and operational security that was difficult to replicate under the routine pressures of an ongoing air campaign. The conditions that made BOLO possible, the months of pattern analysis, the availability of the correct jamming pods, the precise coordination between multiple wings, the weather window that allowed visual engagement, were not conditions that could be manufactured on demand. 2 weeks after BOLO, on January 14, 1967, the Air Force attempted a follow-on deception operation using similar principles. Vietnamese controllers, their procedures modified in the aftermath of January 2nd, did not launch their interceptors. They kept their MiGs on the ground and waited. The American flights turned for home. The Vietnamese had adapted faster than expected. This was not a surprise to Olds. It was, in fact, the most important single lesson he drew from the entire episode, a lesson that he articulated in his post-mission reports and his subsequent recommendations with a clarity that cut through the bureaucratic language in which such documents were usually written. The deception had worked once because the Vietnamese were confident in their ability to identify American formations. The moment that confidence was shaken, the deception could not work again in the same form. The advantage lay always with the side that could generate new surprises faster than the other side could adapt to old ones. The American Tactical Air System, Olds argued, was not structured to do this. It was structured for predictability, for standardization, for the kind of large-scale, coordinated operations that required all participants to know exactly what every other participant was doing at every moment. This was operationally necessary. It was also against an adaptive opponent with fast decision cycles and full awareness of American tactical habits, a strategic liability. What had made Operation BOLO possible was not the formal system. It had been built around it, exploiting the resources and the coordination mechanisms of the formal system while departing from its assumptions. Olds had been able to do this because he was a wing commander with sufficient rank and sufficient personal credibility to push his plan through a bureaucracy that was not designed to produce it. A more junior officer with the same idea would likely have seen it die in the approval process. This was the institutional lesson, the deepest one, and it was the one that the American military found most difficult to absorb. The 7 MiG-21s that fell over the Red River Delta on January 2nd, 1967 were a tactical victory. The question of whether the institutions that fought the air war over North Vietnam were capable of generating that kind of tactical creativity on a systematic basis was a strategic question, and it did not receive a comfortable answer. Robin Olds returned to the United States in September of 1967 at the end of his combat tour, with 4 MiG kills confirmed over Vietnam added to his 12 from World War II. He was, by any measure of the fighter pilot's art, one of the finest combat aviators his country had ever produced. He was assigned to the Air Force Academy as Commandant of Cadets. It was an important assignment, a prestigious assignment, and it was unmistakably a removal from the operational Air Force. The men who made those decisions understood, with the quiet institutional clarity that large military organizations always bring to the management of people who make them uncomfortable, that a wing commander who could devise an operation as unorthodox as BOLO and execute it with the results of January 2nd was also a wing commander who would continue devising unorthodox operations, continue challenging assumptions, continue winning arguments by being right at moments when being right was inconvenient for everyone who had been wrong. The Air Force gave him the academy. He ran it with the same aggressive competence he had brought to everything else. He was not, in any public forum, bitter about the assignment. He understood institutions well enough to understand what the assignment meant, and well enough to understand that saying so openly would accomplish nothing. The pilots who had flown with him at Euban remembered the specific quality of his leadership, not his personality, not his style, not the famous handlebar mustache. He had grown in violation of Air Force grooming regulations and kept on his face for the entire BOLO preparation period as a kind of talisman. But the quality of his thinking, the specific willingness to ask what the enemy assumed, and then to build a trap from the answer, that quality did not disappear when Olds left Euban. It traveled with the pilots who had been formed by it, the men who had sat in the briefing rooms and watched him take apart the Vietnamese air defense system on a blackboard and then put it back together in the shape of a trap. Those men carried it forward into their own commands, their own planning, their own training. They became instructors. They became squadron commanders. They became, in some cases, the men who eventually built the institutions that the American military had failed to build in time for Vietnam. The Navy Fighter Weapons School, which would become known to a later generation by the name of the film made about it, was established at Miramar Naval Air Station in California in 1969. Its founding was a direct institutional response to the kill ratios of the Vietnam Air War, the same kill ratios that had confronted Robin Olds when he arrived at Euban and had framed the problem that Operation BOLO was designed to solve. The Navy's analysis of its own air combat performance over North Vietnam had reached conclusions that were, in their official language, measured and careful, and that were, in their operational implications, damning. Navy pilots were not learning air combat maneuvering. They were not practicing it against realistic opponents. They were not developing the instinctive, physical knowledge of an aircraft's limits that could only come from repeated engagements against someone who was genuinely trying to kill you. They were being trained to operate equipment rather than to fight. The Fighter Weapons School was designed to fix this, to take fleet aviators and subject them to the kind of sustained, intensive, honest combat training that would make them genuinely dangerous in an engagement rather than merely competent at operating the machinery. Its instructors were selected from the pilots with the deepest operational understanding of what air combat actually required, and they trained with directness and a willingness to demonstrate failure that was unusual in a military culture that often preferred the appearance of competence to the honest confrontation of its absence. The Air Force built its own equivalent institution, the Fighter Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, which had existed since the 1950s, but was substantially reformed and refocused in the years following Vietnam. The lessons of the Air War, including the specific lesson of Operation BOLO, the lesson about pattern recognition and adaptive deception, and the danger of confident assumptions, were incorporated into the curriculum. They were not incorporated completely or immediately or without resistance. Institutions have a powerful natural tendency to absorb lessons in the form that is least threatening to their existing structure. The lesson of Operation BOLO could be read as a lesson about the importance of creative wing commanders, which implied that the system should produce more Robin Olds-type figures and give them more operational latitude. Or it could be read as a lesson about the importance of jamming pods and formation procedures, which implied nothing more threatening than a logistics request and a training revision. The second reading was more comfortable for the institutions involved. It was also less complete. The specific deception that Olds devised in the autumn of 1966 cannot be detached from the specific mind that devised it, and that mind was shaped by a lifetime of experience that the formal training system had neither created nor recognized at the time it was most needed. The Vietnamese, for their part, drew their own lessons from January 2nd with a speed that reflected the seriousness of the blow they had absorbed. The stand-down that followed BOLO was not merely a period of reconstruction. It was a period of analysis, conducted with the assistance of Soviet advisors who were not pleased with the losses and who brought their own considerable analytical resources to bear on understanding exactly what had happened. The Soviet assessment of Operation Beyond the Lookout, reconstructed from Vietnamese and Soviet archival sources that became partially accessible in the decades after the war, focused precisely on what Olds had focused on, the assumption of formation identity based on electronic emissions. The Soviets had, in the context of their own air defense planning, considered the theoretical possibility of electronic impersonation as a deception technique. They had considered it and largely dismissed it as too difficult to execute with the precision required. Operation BOLO had demonstrated that it was not too difficult, that the Americans had done it, with the resources available in a forward deployed wing operating under the constraints of the Southeast Asian Air Campaign, was a significant data point. The Vietnamese modified their ground control procedures to require multiple confirmatory indicators before launching MiGs against any inbound formation. A single electronic signature was no longer sufficient to establish identity. The visual character of the formation, its size and its altitude behavior, had to match the electronic profile before controllers would commit their interceptors. This was a sensible adaptation. It was also, in the logic of competitive deception that Olds had articulated after the operation, an escalation of the problem that any future deception would have to solve. The Vietnamese had raised the standard of verification. The next American deception would have to fool not one sensor, but several simultaneously. The specific technological and doctrinal investments that the American military made in the years between Vietnam and the next major air campaign were shaped in ways that are sometimes difficult to trace precisely, but are nevertheless real, by the experience of the air war over North Vietnam and by the specific lesson of what Olds and his planners had done and what it had cost to do it. The development of stealth technology, the investment in electronic warfare that produced the airborne jamming and suppression systems that flew over Iraq in 1991, the doctrine of suppression of enemy air defenses that was refined through the 1970s and 80s, all of these trace a line back to the specific problem that confronted American air power over the Red River Delta, the problem of an adaptive, radar-guided air defense system that learned from experience and adjusted its procedures faster than American tactics were adjusted to meet it. What Olds had demonstrated was not primarily a technological solution. The F-4 was not a more advanced aircraft than the MiGs it destroyed on January 2nd. The jamming pods were not new technology. The missiles that scored the kills had been in service for years. What was new was the use of the enemy's own intelligence picture as the mechanism of his defeat, the exploitation of his confidence in his own observation as the foundation of the trap. This idea that the most dangerous weapon available against an adaptive opponent is a question about what that opponent assumes had been articulated in different forms by military thinkers throughout history. Olds did not invent it. What he did, in the specific operational context of the Vietnam Air War, was demonstrated in a form precise enough and dramatic enough that the military institutions of the United States could not entirely ignore it, even when institutional inertia pushed them toward exactly that response. The 7 MiG-21s that fell over the Red River Delta on the morning of January 2nd, 1967, were the answer to a question that Robin Olds had spent months refining. The question was not how to defeat the Vietnamese air defense system. The question was what the Vietnamese air defense system assumed, and what would happen when that assumption was wrong. He found the assumption. He built the wrong answer into it carefully over months, with borrowed jamming pods and coordinated timing and radio calls that sounded like something they were not. And on a cold January morning over the clouds of the Red River Delta, 7 Vietnamese pilots discovered the answer. They had expected to find bombers. They found hunters. In 1966, Robin Olds had asked the question that broke the assumption. The air forces that followed him into the next generation of air warfare would spend 30 years learning how to institutionalize the asking of it. Some would learn faster than others. All of them would discover that the hardest part was never building the trap. The hardest part was building the kind of mind willing to ask, in the silence of an operations room with borrowed equipment and a skeptical chain of command, what does the enemy believe right now? And how do we make that belief the first thing that kills him? Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.